My name's Elizabeth Hall. I guess my most important role is I'm a mother to two girls, and I am from Windsor, Ontario. The work that I do in labor would be, I'm part of Ontario Public Service Employees Union. We're like a provincial government union. My activism is in not just labor, but also the community. I'm currently the vice president at the OFL, which is the Ontario Federation of Labor, representing workers of color. And then also ACLA and CBTU. I am a member of both of those, which is Asian Canadian Labor Alliance and the Coalition of Black Trades Unionists.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us at The Real News. I really, really appreciate it. And we are, of course, sitting here at the Action Network tent at the 30th Constitutional Convention of the Canadian Labour Congress. And we've been talking to as many folks as we can over the past 2 days, learning as much as we can about the state of the labor movement here in Canada, what our fellow workers across industries are going through, and how folks are fighting, for the working class, right? And I really wanted to sit down and chat with you because of, all the incredible work that you do, really, but especially in terms of your work fighting for workers of color and fighting for migrant workers in Canada, right? And I think that this is something that, really I have a personal connection to, and it's something that we try to cover extensively at the Real News Network as well, because for as exciting as the energy we're seeing in the organized labor movement is, and as exciting as it is to see more established unions, nominally support the sort of energy of young workers at Starbucks and Amazon and service industry workers across the board. That's all very exciting, but there's still so many workers who are left out of the movement, right? Or who are written out of the movement itself because, migrant farm workers, for example, in the United States, farm workers were deliberately written out of the National Labor Relations Act for very racist reasons and are very underrepresented in the movement as a result of it, right? And that doesn't mean that we forget about them.
Right.
That means that we have to fight that much harder to support them and the as they are dealing with hyper exploitation, rampant discrimination and harassment, wage theft, so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask if you could just say a little more about your organizing and advocacy work as it pertains to workers of color and migrant workers in Canada.
So when you talk about migrant workers in the States, it's very, very similar to migrant workers in Canada. And I know this because, I've talked to workers in the States, and when you hear their stories, it's a lot of it happens here in Canada. Being from Windsor, we're about 40 minutes from Leamington, and we have one of the highest population of migrant workers in Ontario. And it's just, I've been doing this work for years, and I think because of the pandemic in the last couple of years, it's just really put a spotlight on what's happening, and people in the community are starting to see it. So growing up in Windsor, you go to Leamington for field trips and stuff, and you would see migrant workers, but I don't think people really knew their working conditions or their living conditions. And when COVID happened, initially when the borders closed, they weren't allowed into Canada. And the farmers, they couldn't find anyone to do this work. Canadians don't want to do this work. I think most people know the health and safety risk and the lack of, everything. Nobody wants to do this hard labor.
You get paid like shit, you got no bathrooms, you're getting harassed by supervisors.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I think the employer wants migrant workers because they are able to do whatever they want, pay lower wages, not pay them, they're working overtime but not getting paid overtime. They are doing work that they're not supposed to do, like demeaning personal errands for their employer. There's on and on. And when they weren't coming in, the employer went to the government, was able to lobby the government. So if you have money, basically, the government listens and they open the borders, then they were deemed essential. So they came in, and the problem was, when you look at essential workers, healthcare workers were essential workers. There's a number of them. We called them heroes. We put signs on our lawns and all this stuff. But when the migrant workers came in, they were essential, but they didn't get the same, welcome. They didn't get the same protections as other essential workers got. So we started to hear about workers getting sick in the workplaces. And what happened was, in Canada, like if certain workplace worker got sick, they got COVID, and I don't know the numbers, but the health unit would come in and basically close the business. And we knew there were hundreds of workers like getting sick on these farms, and we had to go and make sure someone checked on them. And we were able to get a lot of information from the workers because we've done so much work, we have a history and there's a trust. And they were able to share pictures of, what they got to eat. They told us how they didn't get PPE, and without them even telling you, in certain workplaces, you cannot social distance. You're literally working beside another person. Their housing, there's definitely no social distancing. Like you're sleeping in bunk beds with another worker, or like two bunk beds so there's 4 workers in a small room with shared bathrooms and shared kitchens and things like that. And then on top of all that, they're restricted, like they can't leave the property anymore because the employer were not letting them leave the property to take groceries or anything because, their reason was to protect the community in case somebody had COVID. Meanwhile, they come in knowing they didn't have COVID. These employers were given money to quarantine their workers. We know a lot of them were not quarantined, and there was no accountability. So no one asked the employer, can you show us a receipt that this worker was quarantined? No, they just pocketed this money, and the workers were maybe quarantined for a day, 2 days, a week, and then they were working. But with that said, they still did not have COVID. And the reason people were getting sick was some of these farms were bringing in people from the community to do the work. So they were actually bringing COVID into these workplaces, and the migrant workers were getting blamed for, bringing COVID into the country. I mean, I remember going to a store and purchasing all this stuff, and the cash register lady, whatever, she said, "Oh, you're buying all this stuff. Are you stocking up?" Because I'm like, "No, I'm bringing them to Leamington." And this guy behind me, and I had my daughter, which bothered me, and he said, "Why you bring this stuff to those people? They bring all these diseases in, brought in COVID." And it just, this is, what's happening with migrant workers. And the good thing is people started to see how these workers were being treated. And even though I'm telling you the story of this one person, there was a lot of people that brought in PPE and brought in donations of food. Businesses were cooking culturally appropriate food so that we can bring it down to Leamington. And we had boxes and boxes of fresh produce coming in from Toronto that we would, try to get to these farms, to the workers. We had grandmothers making masks for them. It really showed people still cared, and they were able to, get up and, take care of each other. And these workers, it's not like this is their first time. Some of the workers have been coming for 10, 20, 30 years, even generations, and they're still, treated like this. So.
Right. I mean, and we're talking in this corner of the country primarily agricultural workers.
Yes, like
Yeah.
farm workers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I just wanted to kind of clarify that because, in the States and I know in Canada too, right? I mean, there are definitely pockets across the labor market where employers exploit migrant labor and even migrant child labor, as we've been hearing about in the United States. So we're talking meatpacking plants, right? We're talking construction sites, but we're also talking about farming operations across the country. And so, and what you were saying is that when COVID hit, and farm workers were deemed essential along with other classes of workers, but no one wanted to do those jobs, and so the farmers lobbied the government to essentially ease migration restrictions so that migrant farm workers could come in.
Right.
The farmers would get paid for having those migrant farm workers, essential migrant farm workers, come in, and they would get paid to quarantine them, but they wouldn't actually do that, and they would just pocket the money and kick the workers out into the fields. Then they would pen the workers in, not let them leave, and occasionally bring in workers from around town who would get them sick, and then they would be stuck there in a locked pen. And do I have that right?
Yep. That's exactly what was happening.
Cool. That's great. Jesus, man. I mean, that's so dark, and I'm so grateful to you and to others who are, doing everything you can to fight for and fight alongside these workers who, as we said, are so often, too often, left by the wayside. And I wanted to sort of ask about that for a second. I would say in the United States, there are some exceptions. There are established unions that have gone to the mat for the most marginalized and exploitative workers. You're seeing positive developments like Labor's Local 79, the construction workers union in New York City. Instead of doing what people typically think of construction workers in New York City doing, which is blaming undocumented workers and non-union workers as like the enemy who are undercutting our jobs and our wages. They're reaching out to these workers.
Yeah.
Largely migrant and undocumented workers in the city or returning citizens coming home from prison, who are ripe for hyper-exploitation and have to work for the most union-busting, exploitative, corner-cutting, demolition and construction companies in the city.
Yeah.
So the union's reaching out to these workers and fighting for them, creating things like an excluded workers fund because they weren't eligible for federal COVID or state COVID benefits. That's really positive to see. But it's still, in my assessment, the exception that proves the rule. And so I wanted to ask, where the plight of migrant farm workers specifically, in your experience, where that fits into the broader labor movement, if at all, in Canada.
So the work that I do, it is community work. I was lucky enough where we were able to pass a resolution at my union to say, okay, let's start doing some work with organizations like Justicia. So the resolution was about when we do training or reaching out to the community, sometimes we need the resources and funds to do this work. And making unions recognize that you have that potential and these are workers too. And we were able to get that convention floor to pass a resolution. So that allowed me, who moved the resolution, to be able to do some more of that work. I'm hoping that it was moved because they want to help workers, right? But I think at the same time, this is just a part of me that thinks it's about also not advertising, but a lot of unions do things for the wrong reasons, right? Like they want that stamp, like their logo on stuff, or they want recognition for things. As I did this work, I sometimes will mention my union, but I wasn't forced to, so I just continued doing it. I do think more unions need to look at not just their own members, right? Like when you look at unions historically, they don't just advocate for your membership, your dues paying membership. Historically they fought for workers in general. And that's what our unions, all unions everywhere should be doing, is they need to see, like, why do we have a problem? Why is there this low percentage of our population, not part of a union? Why, like, how are people viewing unions? And as a racialized woman, I think that our communities, like, have we don't trust unions because they've historically discriminated, or they've used our communities for certain things. So if you continue to do that, why would we want to participate in a union when even after you join, only a certain group of people get to benefit from some of those things? And I think the labor movement needs to wake up. I think this is the time. I believe it's the time. I mean, I've never heard the words equity, diversity, inclusiveness in spaces like this as much as I've heard it in the last 2 years. But with that being said, I'm just hearing it, right? Like, I need to see it as as a human rights activist. You need to show me, or like, I can't continue, making you look good because I'm part of a community that has been there for me. And that's where that's where my fight is. But I do see this as a moment where there is so much opportunity for unions to do the real work, for them to survive really in the long run. Because right now you can have a rally to fight for whatever the issue is now, but after a month later, like when you're done fighting, the bigger issue is still out there. There is still, not enough housing for people. The price of food has gone up. Like, people cannot afford groceries anymore. Where I live, the cost of rent, there's so much homelessness. The unemployment rate in my area has gone up. I mean, everything. So I feel like workers are at a point where they're angry. They see what's happening. And I think that's where unions need to tap into it and say, listen, what can we do to help and not take over what you're already doing, right? Here's a space for you to speak, tell us what your experience, what is it that we need to do? Because when you talk about affordable housing or whatever, labor will say, okay, this is what we need to do. But we're not the ones struggling. Like, if you're part of a union, you have a collective agreement. You make pretty good money, and you have a union that protects you. You probably have benefits, pension, all this stuff. And you're fighting for people that can barely pay rent, or you're trying to increase wages. Meanwhile, you're getting paid $25. We need to start moving aside and letting the people who are living these experiences be the voice, So.
Well, and just on that note, to really underline the stakes, first and foremost, they're the obvious human stakes which you laid out, right? People not being able to sleep under a roof, right? People not being able to feed themselves or their children. People not being able to access the health care that they desperately need. People who can be fired from their job like that, just for who they are, what they wear, no just cause whatsoever, right? We have so far to go in fighting these injustices and fighting them for all working people, like you said, not just those who are fortunate enough to have a collective bargaining agreement. So there are those basic first principle human stakes of we need to do this because it's what's right.
Right.
then there's like the secondary stakes, like you said, is like we need to do this, otherwise the labor movement will die, right? We've been in decline for decades, and so for our own salvation, we need to be thinking about how we can expand our movement and reach as many workers as we possibly can, and think in that sort of mode. And then, like, on the third order that I was thinking of as you were talking is like, we're not the only ones making a play for, to appeal to working class people who are feeling that pain right now, right? There is a rising, increasingly fascistic right wing that is speaking to this pain and harnessing it for its own political agenda, right? And I think the question is, as the great labor organizer Amina Sheikh put it in a recent piece that she published, is like, how are labor and the left rising to meet this discontent, this frustration and anger and pain with the cost of living crisis, with the eroding social safety net, with increased climate catastrophe and endless war? Like, all of this stuff is happening and working people are feeling it. So what are labor and the left doing to meet people where they are, speak to that pain, and harness that into something, a movement that can fight for better? Because right at the same time, the right is making those appeals and tapping into that anger and doing what they always do, which is directing it back towards migrants, queer people, trans people, just carving out certain privileged sectors of the real, true working class, and everyone else is trying to steal something from you. And I guess I meant to ask in that regard, when we're talking about the migrant farm workers in your area, are these primarily workers coming from Latin America and the Caribbean?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, I don't know, I assume that, like in the United States, they get sucked into that reactionary sort of fervor, and painted as like the ones who are stealing our jobs, and the ones that need to be targeted for elimination. Anyway, you've said so much that's just making me kind of really, really think about how important it is to act now, because this shit isn't going away, and the stakes are only going to continue to increase dramatically. And so I guess I just wanted to sort of ask, in that vein, what would it look like, or what should it look like for the labor movement, but also for all of us, right, to make that commitment to fighting for the working class writ large, not just organized labor?
That's a hard question. I think that the key piece is like to make people realize, like, it's not just about themselves, and to really think about, like, who are you doing this for in this moment? Because, like, as activists, we became activists because we wanted to be the voice of someone that didn't have a voice, or, we're fighting for the rights of our workers. But when you're thinking about that, I think about the future generation. Like, even as an activist before I had kids, it's very different now that I have kids, because as I go to a rally, it's like, I don't want my kids to go to this rally. I don't want them fighting for this, and it makes me think of everything that I have and all the people that kind of came before me so that I can have those things. And I think people need to understand, like, sometimes people think activism might be a bad word, and I think if you want to do the right thing and be that voice, that, to me, you're an activist, and you're doing the right thing. And I think labor needs to be like, I don't know, I can't see this as being a quick fix, right? Because labor, the structure of the movement needs to be reinvented. Like, I don't want to say just smash it down and build it, but in a way, you kind of have to really look at the structure of your union and the people that are making these decisions. And like, are you including voices? There are like, every union has equity groups like workers of color, people with disability, all these different equity, but what, you're giving them a space and sometimes a voice, but are you really listening? Are you really taking what they're saying and saying, how do we fix this? How do we open this door? Like, what do we need to do? And I think that's the problem, is we're doing things because we have to. We have a committee because we have to, but then are you going to do something, you know? So I mean, I got so many things going through my head to answer this question, but I don't really have like one solution, I guess, because it's so hard. I don't know. I think that the key thing for me right now doing this work is trying to get unions, like the labor movement, to see how important it is for them to connect with the community, like not just workers in their unions, like all workers as a whole. And they definitely have the resources to do this, and this is the moment to do it, because I think people are ready. Like, I think workers are ready to say enough is enough, and we're not gonna take this anymore. Like, people can't survive.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work, so please tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.